people probably, if you know me at all, will know me from like YouTube atheism stuff, I guess. I have a PhD in philosophy. I publish stuff these days in philosophy of religion. Published a number of papers on the Kalam cosmological argument. Just had one published the other day with a friend of mine, Joe Schmid, on the Grim Reaper paradox. So, and I'm thinking about maybe one more Grim Reaper paradox paper on my sleeve somewhere, and now I'm thinking about maybe trying to do some work on the fine-tuning argument.
The second question would be, what got you into philosophy? For example, like fields such as like philosophical logic, philosophy of physics, and so on and so forth.
Well, I think what got me into philosophy, in some ways, I found a book on my parents' bookshelf that was called The Great Philosophers. And it was just like a chapter on, one chapter on, with a single philosopher being dealt with in each one. And I read the Socrates chapter because I think that was the first one, and quite identified with the character of Socrates in some way, in how he was depicted in this sort of biography. Because, I think he liked questioning stuff and was kind of irreverent. And I don't know, something about the character sort of spoke to me, and it made me interested in philosophy. I felt like this was something that was made for me, or I was made for it, or something. And then how did I get into specific bits of philosophy? I think that's just, you just find out about the subject and you, exploring the stuff that you find interesting, just pulling at that curiosity that you've got. So I think, people can presumably relate to that sort of thing where it might not be philosophy, but maybe you're into playing chess or something, and you get super geeky into it. And if someone says, why do you like this particular opening? I mean, it's difficult to say exactly why, but that's when you looked into it, this is the one that caught your imagination, So I just sort of gravitated towards, my PhD was in what kind of metaphysics, but kind of philosophical logic, sort of in the middle between those, about like temporal logic and some idea of the combination of time and modality just sort of caught my imagination. So that's what I pursued for ages. And then years later, I think I, for some reason, my imagination got caught again in kind of philosophy of religion stuff. And that's what I've been doing for the last, 8 years or something. But yeah, for me, it's kind of idle because I don't do it for a living. I have a normal job. So I can do what I like. I can research anything I want to. I don't have to worry about, fitting in with academia or keeping my job or anything like that. It's completely independent. It's just a hobby. So I just do what I think is fun. And that's the only reason I do any of it, really.
So the first question somebody asked on text was, can you go through Grim Reaper's paradox and what issues does it posit for the theist who believes God has knowledge?
What problems does it pose for a theist who thinks that God has knowledge? I don't know that I've ever thought about the connection between the two things before. And on its face, it's not clear that there is a connection between them. If you explain the Grim Reaper paradox, so that's like, it goes back to this philosopher from this American philosopher called Jose Benedetti, who wrote a book in the 60s, which was about the nature of infinity. It's called an Infinity, an Essay in Metaphysics. And in that, he developed what's come to be known as a Benedetti paradox. And that paradox, like one version of that, is the Grim Reaper paradox. The Grim Reaper paradox was invented by this guy, Jose Benedetti, effectively. And the easiest way to understand it is to think about an example of how it could be stated, right? So picture a line, like a path from point A to point B, and stood at point A is a man, let's say Fred, and he intends to walk from point A to point B. But he doesn't realize that there is a hidden entity halfway along the path, like a demon or something, which is determined to arrest the man's passage should he make it halfway along the line. Right, so he'll conjure into existence an impassable wall and block the man's passage if he gets halfway down the pathway, meaning that he's not going to get to B, right? Because were he to get halfway, a wall, an impassable obstacle would be created and would prevent him from moving any further. But he also doesn't realize that a quarter of the way along towards B, there's another such entity also similarly determined to arrest the man's progress any further, prevented by making another obstacle in its path, were he to make it that far. And there's also another entity just the same, 1/8 of the way and 1/16 of the way, 1/32 of the way, etc., etc. So what we've got is a sequence of such entities ever closer to point A. We're just like a Zeno's paradox. We're just halving the distance between the one that's next closest to him from the one that was further away. And in that way, we can pack in infinitely many such entities, each of which is determined to stop him or to get to that point, their allocated point. Another question is, is the man going to be able to get from point A to point B? And the thought would be, well, no, obviously he's not going to, because there's like infinitely many, let's say, demons that are ready to block his path should he make it as far as their particular bit. But because there's no closest one to him, for every demon lying in wait for him, there's at least one more that's closer to point A, right? So there's no first one that will be the one that stops him. So, take the middle way guy. He's obviously not going to be the one that stops the man getting to point B, because for him to have made it as far as the halfway point, he'd have had to have already made it through all these infinite entities that are determined to stop him. So he's not going to be stopped by the guy in the middle. He's not going to be stopped by the guy at the quarter of the way point either, for the same reasoning. He would have had to have gone through infinitely many obstacles to get there. But so for each and every entity that's lying in wait, it's not going to be the case that that entity stops him. So there's no such entity such that one is the one that will stop him. Nevertheless, he's not going to make his progress from point A to point B. And that's basically the paradox. Like he can't take a step forwards, but also there's nothing in particular that can stop him from taking it forward. So there's different ways you can. I like that example because it seems quite vivid. Not necessarily the best for if you're looking for like some straightforward contradiction or something. There are probably ones that will make that clearer, maybe. But the general idea is that you've got like a sequence of things, right? And maybe there's a last one, like the guy that was in the halfway point in my example, but there's no first one, right? It's just a sequence that, in this case, kind of converges towards point A, but without there being a first entity in it. As long as you've got a sequence like that, and you've got some kind of rule which says that they will basically have property P if and only if none of the earlier ones have got property P, right? So in this case, it was that the entities would block the man's progress if and only if none of the previous ones had already blocked his progress. Like, I'll throw the wall up if he gets this far, is what each one of them said. So if you've got a line of entities where there's no beginning one, and each of them is determined to follow a rule like that, then you get a contradiction. That's the clearest way to put it. And you can just derive that, right? You can just make a model, right? It's just a sort of totally ordered sequence, right, which is beginningless in one end and closed at the other. And then you just have this property. So each one of them instantiates property P if and only if none of the ones down towards the open end of that structure have instantiated property P. And you can just straightforwardly derive a contradiction in logic from that type of structure. So it's inconsistent. What this argument is used, I mean, the idea is there's supposed to be, there is a contradiction in that type of scenario. Logicians and philosophers have drawn different lessons from this, like what does it mean? What does it say about the world or whatever? I'm trying to say this neutrally, but it's quite hard, of course, because I have a distinct view. But so in particular, religious philosophers have used it as an argument to try and like a Kalam style argument, or at least an argument for premise 2 of the Kalam, which says that the universe had a beginning, right? Because they'll say, like, you could have one, let's say, Reaper, right? There's something that's determined to kill Fred if Fred is still alive. There are lots of different ways of, if my loose talk when I give an example feels like it's got a loophole to you, just remember that like this can be translated fully formally, so there won't really be a loophole in that sense. But imagine there's a beginningless sequence of Reapers, right? One every year, and that the past has no beginning, right? So they're evenly spaced out, but there's infinitely many of them. There's not a first one, although maybe if you want to consider today's one being the last one, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But the point is that there's no earliest one. And each one of them, has property P, if and only if none of the earlier ones do. Now, that's a version of the Benedetti paradox, right? It's basically the Grim Reaper paradox. Now, this is philosopher Bob Koons, and there's a paper in 2014, which I think is called The Revenge of the Kalam, or Revenge of the Grim Reaper or something. I actually can't remember what the paper's called, but in that he basically sets that idea up. But he says, look, if there were a beginningless past, then because a single Reaper who says to himself, I'll kill Fred if he's still here at that point, as obviously one Reaper like that is possible. And he appeals to this like recombination principle, such that like any two things that are spatiotemporally distinct from each other, it's possible that there's like a single universe with both of them in together. Like if it's possible that there's a dragon, and it's possible that there's a unicorn, then there's a possible world where there's both a dragon and a unicorn together. So you think of it as like a sort of copy and paste principle. So he thinks that because you can get like one copy of a Grim Reaper if you had an infinite, beginningless universe, you just could copy and paste that Reaper such that it appeared once a year, right, all the way back through time with no beginning. So if there was a beginningless past, those Koons, then it could be filled with Grim Reapers, basically. But if it was filled with Grim Reapers, then there'd be a paradox, right? There'd be a contradiction. So it couldn't be that there's an infinite past, is basically his idea. He sort of assumes, he says, and he'll assume that the past is beginningless for reductio, which is funny because I think there's actually nothing important for you to say that that's the assumption that needs to be denied. Basically, what me and Joe and Troy, who's on this call as well, have done recently is published some papers showing how you can deny, or at least you can seriously question different assumptions in this argument, and not just the one that says that the past had to have a beginning. So, I have a particular view about that. So hopefully that's sort of set up problem. Like I said, it's difficult to not just sort of like set it up in such a way that it seems uncharitable. It is just my view or something. I'm trying to state it neutrally. I think the questioner, if he's here, whoever that was that gave the question in the first place, might have to say a bit more about what they have in mind in terms of like God's knowledge, because I'm not.
The follow-up from him would be like, which God is all-powerful and all-knowing, with the Grim Reaper's paradox, which suggests an infinite number of events happening in a finite amount of time, something that seems logically impossible.
So the idea is that God couldn't know infinitely many things happening. Yeah, so I don't think these. So there's a whole bunch of arguments that try and exploit like we could call the infinite God objection, right? Which is like, imagine Hilbert's Hotel existed or something. I mean, some people will say that's absurd, so it couldn't exist. And then like William Lane Craig, for instance. And some people think it's a good reply to him to say, well, there are infinitely many numbers, aren't there? And God must know what they all are, must know the properties of each one of them and stuff. So that just means that God's knowledge is a bit like Hilbert's Hotel. And, if he added one more thing for him to know, he'd still know infinitely many things. If he subtracted one, it'd still be infinitely many things, etc. It's just like Hilbert's Hotel. And I think, not that that's what this questioner was asking about, but like, I think if you try and say, oh, here's a problem for God's knowledge on the basis that it's like composed of infinitely many things, whether it's that you're trying to say it's like Hilbert's Hotel, or whether you're trying to say it's like a Benedetti paradox as a result, I think the problem for me as an atheist, I just think it's not a very good attack line against a theist, because I think, there's nothing, unless the theist is already committed to a strong kind of account of how God knows things, such that he can know infinitely many things or something. It's quite easy for them to say something like quite vague about how God understands or knows things. Say, well, he doesn't have propositional knowledge, right? It's just like an awareness, a unified awareness of everything all at the same time. And then, there goes the premise of your argument. Like, I mean, he kind of knows infinitely many things, but also it's just like a oneness or something. And I don't know what we're talking about at that point. It's one of those points where like just the room for maneuver for theists at that point can be quite large, and the attack coming should be targeted at something more where there's less room for wiggling out of it. I think for it to be a plausible looking attack line. So for me, I'm not a big fan of those sort of infinite God objections. Right. But maybe I might have missed something in the nuance of what the questioner had in mind.
I think it was covered. It's satisfying. So another question is, what do you think of James Anderson's view of law of non-contradiction?
Well, a few years ago, I published a paper about critiquing his paper with Greg Welty, and then actually had a discussion with him on a YouTube channel about that. So I think he's a nice guy, and we had a nice conversation, and we've had some friendly emails back and forth. But I think he's a credible kind of person. I haven't seen anything kind of weird from him, so he seems like a nice guy. His argument his view is about divine conceptualism. So it's an account of the nature of abstract objects, and his idea is, not so much his idea. The idea he endorses, because it's an old idea, is that that abstract objects are not, obviously they're not physical things, but they're not like a kind of Bragian third realm or Platonic object, right? But they are in fact conceptual. Nuance is that unlike, sort of psychologism or something where, even then I'm not sure anyone's ever proposed a kind of reductive psychological account of abstract objects really, but there's this sort of straw man that you could say what all abstract objects are, their nature is just as ideas in the minds of people or something. But he is advocating for a kind of conceptualism where it's not, it's not grounded out in the minds of humans, but in a divine mind. So God has kind of unchanging ideas of things like, I don't know, abstract mathematical, logical propositions, and whatever you want abstract objects to play, possibilities, possible worlds, things like that. So they're all kind of bracketed in under divine ideas, divine thoughts or something, and that position is called divine conceptualism. And basically, I think I made a number of different lines of attack in that paper. So my paper really uninterestingly called something like response to the Lord of non-contradiction or something. But I mean, effectively, I have this, I don't know if it's clear or convoluted, but an argument, I made 3 arguments, but the one at the end, it seems like to me, it's the most substantial one, which is that there's a kind of like a regress that's faced by the divine conceptualist. I'm not sure I'll be able to remember the detail of the argument quite correctly, but I think my thought was something like, there's this problem like, so take a proposition like Pythagoras' theorem, right, which explains how the sides of the triangle in a right angle triangle are related to each other. Right? Everybody knows what Pythagoras' theorem is. Now, that's basically an abstract object, and it's the sort of thing a divine conceptualist is going to say is a thought in the divine mind or divine idea or something. But then my critique of it is like, well, let's say that there's this thought, reference that as thought T, right? Then what's T about? What's the content of T? Because very plausibly, all thoughts are about stuff, right? Intentionality just means that like mental states are about things. right? You can have a smell of chocolate and the taste of tea or whatever, but you can't just have a mental state that's not something or about something. At least that's kind of general intentional thesis. If that's true, then this divine thought is about something, right? So what's it about? And it's tempting to say, well, it's about how the two short sides of the triangle, the square of those is equal to the square of the long side, right? That's what it's about. But then it just seems like it has to, it can't have, but like the thing is, if that's what it's about, then it's about Pythagoras' theorem. But the point is, what we're saying is that Pythagoras' theorem is this thought. But that seems like it's just, you're saying that the thought's about itself, right? And that seems to me that you can't really have that. Like, I can have a thought that's kind of reflexive, like I can think about thinking. I'm thinking about my own thinking now because I've started saying it. But what I can do is kind of think about the last thing I just thought about. Like, and I can make a concept about it and go, oh, that thing I just thought, that was a concept, or that was a thought, or, something. I can make it the object of my intentional states. But I can't make the very thought that I'm having now be the subject of my mental state's intentionality. It's like the loop is too narrow, right? It can't contain itself. And it actually seems to me that if you try and insist that it can contain itself, then you can start to see that there's what I think is a vicious regress, right? Because let's suppose we write it down like this, right? Which is, we say T, that names the thought, and then open brackets, right? And then we'll put the content of the thought in there. So that might be, I don't know, A or something, right? And that just says that thought T is about content A. But now, if I put the T inside the bracket, so thought T is about thought T, then I think I'm entitled to ask what the innermost instance of T is about as well. And that seems to me you could maybe write another open brackets and you're going to have to put T in it again. And then I'm going to say, well, what's that thought about, right? And it just seems to me that you can never specify the content of the outermost thought because it's just this promissory note of just another instance of T about which you can say, well, okay, sure, but what's that about? And it goes on forever without any kind of grounding or anything. It just seems to me that there's no stable way of saying that the thought really has any content at all. So a divine thought can't be about itself. But then that means that the thought that's supposed to be about Pythagoras' theorem can't really be about Pythagoras. The thought that's supposed to be Pythagoras' theorem also be about Pythagoras' theorem. Otherwise you get into this regress thing. So then what's it about? Right? God has this thought T, and we say that thought is Pythagoras' theorem. But what's it about, right? Is he thinking about the law of non-contradiction or what I just had for dinner or something? Like, how could it be about something else? Like, in virtue of what? Is it Pythagoras' theorem then, if it's just a thought that's about some other irrelevant content? It just feels like there's no good answer here. I don't see how the divine conceptualist can really explain this. And I think the answer that they take, I think he wrote a blog post since, and I think I read it, but I can't quite recall. But I think what he does is ends up saying that divine thoughts just aren't about anything, don't have any intentionality. Although I might be mistaken, but at least one way you could go, I suppose. But the problem with that, really, it seems to me, is that if these divine intentional entities or divine thoughts or whatever, if they're supposed to be mental, if I'm supposed to consider that sort of thing is mental, as opposed to just like a Platonic object or something, then it better be like mental things that I'm acquainted with, right? And I think the intentionality thesis is very plausible. So the mental states are always about things. But then these mental states are not about things, right? If you take this this way of escaping my dilemma. But then I'm just sort of wondering, so hold on a second, in what sense is this mental? Right? It just feels like a different concept from what I mean by mental. And also, I mean, if you go into the technicalities of how he lays the argument out, they kind of require, or they use the idea that you can, that all intentional states, all mental states are intentional as part of their argument before this. So it's like they want to use the intentionality thesis, but not until it gets in the way of the conclusion, and then they want to kick it away. And it kind of feels to me like but they're kicking it away because they're saying, here's a bunch of thoughts that are not about anything, like God's thoughts. So you require the intentionality thesis, but only when it suits you. So I think that doesn't feel like a great way of responding to the argument either. So yeah, I guess I could keep talking about any of these things for ages. I'll try and be brief. Feel free to interrupt me.
The same questioner actually, he said, and ask whether all divine conceptualist views fall short to his critiques.
Well, I don't know. I haven't surveyed all possible or even all made divine conceptualist programs. That maybe there's one that doesn't, right? But what I would say is, is it susceptible to that type of argument that I just made? Right? I mean, you could say, well, my version of divine conceptualism, blah blah blah, has some difference to it, right? But if that difference doesn't avoid the argument that I just gave, then I don't see that it's then it's not going to escape the critique, basically. And I do find it difficult to understand how you could have a version of divine conceptualism that escapes it, because maybe I'm getting something wrong. Maybe you can have fully reflexive thoughts. I don't know. Some people say Aristotle thought you could. Okay. But anyway, I don't know. I guess the answer is I don't know if there's any better ones out there. But I think Greg Welty's kind of widely regarded as one of the, if not the leading divine conceptualist. And I did read quite a lot of his stuff when I was coming up with this in the first place. So I think it's pretty good. The critiquing, nothing is ever completely decisive in philosophy, obviously, but I think that argument needed this point to be made. And, Anderson was quite complimentary about the critique. He thought it was easily the best one that he'd seen in the sort of 10 years since the argument had been published. And I did read a bunch of really terrible replies. It was published in Philosophia Christi, which is an evangelical American journal that publishes stuff on philosophy of religion but widely sort of Christian philosophy. And they published some a bunch of, I think 3 or 4 together with Anderson replies to the paper. And I thought they were all terrible. And I think Anderson did too, but he liked the critique that I made. So I don't know. It doesn't really mean very much, but there it is.
And the final one from this same questioner would be, ask him whether he believes that the idea of non-propositional knowledge and God, as seen as in the Neoplatonist traditions, whether this will be, he's asking, is this an unintelligible view or not? And maybe he's referring to William Alston's position on this and his view as a reference.
I don't have any good reason to say it's unintelligible, no. Alston's view is a bit like the British idealists, so that's like McTaggart and a bunch of 3 or 4 other like noteworthy British philosophers around the turn of the 20th century, and they have a kind of Hegel-inspired picture of the universe and how knowledge and stuff works, and that's basically what Alston is resurrecting and applying in that case. And I don't know enough about it to say that it's unintelligible, but I think it's got a reasonable pedigree. I mean, the British idealists weren't trying to get ponage on YouTube by coming up with it as an argument. It's got a heritage to it. I couldn't really critique it enough. I don't want to say stuff about things I don't know. It doesn't seem on its face unintelligible to me.
So another question would be, what does Malpass think of Zarapor's mapping technique argument against the realization of an infinite essential series?
I don't know it, but I do know Zarapor a little bit, and I think he's great. I think he's a really good philosopher. He wrote a very good paper critiquing one of mine, and I think I thought it was a bit like the Anderson one, where I read a bunch, 3 or 4 papers of people who tried to write critiques, and I thought they were weak, and then Zarapor's was much better. So I actually sent him an email saying I really liked your paper critiquing my paper, and we sort of broed out on that. But yeah, I don't know the specific argument that you're referring to, but I think he's great.
So somebody's asking, my understanding is that you are a non-naturalist Platonist. Can you say something about your objections to ontological naturalism?
That's a very big, it's a wide topic. Okay, so I guess, look, here's one way of thinking about it is Fregean style arguments that argue for Platonism. I mean, I quite like those. I'm not saying that there's obviously a huge literature about this, but Frege's argument is basically, just to make it quite simple, Frege's argument is like, the idea is, and this really goes to what I was just talking about a moment ago, but I guess the thought is like, I can think the same thing as you, right? Like when we both think about Pythagoras' theorem, we both think about Pythagoras' theorem as one thing, we're both thinking about that thing. What am I saying when I say there's something in common that we're both thinking about? It's not that there's a bit of my brain that physically overlaps with a bit of your brain, like Siamese twins or something. It's not a physical thing in common that we have when that thought takes place. And it's also not a mental thing that we have in common, strictly speaking. I mean, my thoughts are not accessible to you to see, nor are they accessible for you to share, really, right? My thoughts are metaphysically private. Only I can have them, and you can't actually read them or participate in them in any way. Same vice versa kind of thing. But the way that you explain how we have something in common is to say that there must be a third type of thing, which is the sort of thing that can be what a thought is about, right? So it's not shared common physical matter. It's not shared mental matter, whatever that means. It's not the actual same thought in common. It's just a thought has the same content. And that idea of the content of a thought is what people mean by Platonic object these days. A lot of people who have done, a bit of philosophy will know about like Plato's. They'll get maybe a thumbnail sketch of Plato's ideas, and they'll know that it's something like he thinks there are like these things that exist in a different realm and blah blah blah. Often they're very uncharitable explanation of what Plato's views are. And then when they hear someone referencing Platonism in like contemporary analytic philosophy, they think that they mean all of Plato's theory about the forms and whatever. And I had that in a debate with this guy called Jay Dyer, who is a kind of orthodox Christian presuppositionalist who talks a lot like he knows lots of philosophy, but I think doesn't nearly as much as he thinks he does. But I think when I mentioned Platonism in that discussion, he kind of got hot and heavy about me therefore believing everything about Plato's theory of the forms or something. But the modern Platonism is just this view that there's some abstract entities of some description that are not physical or mental, and they play different roles in our theories. So, for instance, it can be that it's the type of content that your thoughts or perhaps your sentences, etc., could be about. Right? It's the kind of object of aboutness. And, it's a convenient way of explaining and rationalizing things like how mathematicians talk about their subject matter. For instance, they refer to the natural number series or whatever, taken at face value, they're quantifying exponentially over something that's not physical or mental. So that type of Platonism works well if we're trying to give an account of what mathematical objects are, right? Sort of economy, sort of a theoretical economy versus ontological cost kind of equation. And it can maybe, it seems like it earns its keep because it explains away lots of stuff for a rather minimal ontological cost, you might say. I guess there's a whole other aspect of this. I won't go into this really at all right now, although I can if you want to, but there's also arguments about the nature of like meta-ethics, where it seems to me that I'm kind of drawn to the idea that there are abstract objects there too, things like moral values or whatever, which are mind independent things. They're not physical things. They're not simply tokens of thoughts or something. So yeah, broadly speaking, now is that a critique of naturalism? Maybe, right? The position in meta-ethics where you think that there's mind independent moral facts or whatever that are not reducible to physical facts. I mean, the thesis that there are mind-independent moral facts that are reducible to physical facts is what meta-ethicists call naturalism. Or I guess where they're reducible to some other type of thing, non-moral facts. And the non-naturalist is just simply defined as someone who thinks that there is no reduction of moral and non-moral, and that's all, right? It's, strictly speaking, you could be a naturalist in the kind of metaphysical sense, but a non-naturalist in the meta-ethical sense are not actually logically incompatible with each other. So it's not quite clear that you have to be an anti-realist or something. If I think to myself, well, I'm a naturalist in the sense that, let's say, the universe is causally closed. Like, that's one way people hash out what naturalism means. Well, the universe could be causally closed, and there could still be non-reducible moral facts, right? Because they wouldn't exert causal influence anyway. Or, there could be numbers. Numbers don't cause things to happen on anybody's view. So, not a problem. If your version of naturalism is the universe is causally closed, you can still think that they're abstract objects, that they're not actually incompatible with each other. So, yeah, I guess my worry would be that thinking that you believe in things like abstract objects means that you're some kind of non-scientific person who goes beyond empirical whatevers and believes in something weird and spooky. And I don't think it's like that at all.
The next question would be, do you think phenomenal states are intentional?
Broadly speaking, yes, I think so. And maybe not, I'm not really an expert on this, so I can tell you not very much, but I guess it seems to me that they are. Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe someone's going to say, well, qualia or some really basic notion. Maybe, I don't know, but it just seems to me that these kind of interesting psychological states are intentional, like love and rationality. Like, most of the things that take up maybe on a sort of atomic phenomenological level, I don't know, maybe they're not, but yeah, broadly speaking, I think the intentionality thesis is right.
What do you think of model collapse arguments and divine simplicity?
These questions are always like, what do you think about this thing and combined with another? I've never thought about that combination before.
Well, typically model collapse arguments are usually aimed at divine simplicity, so it relates in that sense.
Are they? I always thought modal collapse arguments being about the contingency argument. And
yeah, that is true too.
Yeah, so maybe I'm not familiar with the connection to divine simplicity as such. So I'm not sure I've got anything to say about if you want to talk about the connection between those two. That's another one where, like, if the questioner could explain what they have in mind, I might be able to respond a bit. But even then, it would be off the cuff. So I don't know if that would be helpful or anything.
Yeah. So another question would be, do you hold to the PSR? If yes, why? If no, why? If yes, why? And they edited the message and said, to which version, as in like a strong notion or, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's crucial. There's not just one principle of sufficient reason. There's loads of different candidates. So it's not well formed to say, do you believe in the principle of sufficient reason? Is there any I believe in? I mean, it's easy. So I guess this is a bit of a philosophy answer, maybe a political answer. I don't know, but like, it's easy to say that like really, really extremely strong ones do seem implausible, and extremely weak ones are probably so weak that there's nothing to object to. The question is, what point do I start switching between liking them and not liking them? I suppose. I definitely do think that the strongest ones are obviously too strong. I mean, well, I guess, yeah. If you can formulate it in such a way that there's a plausible looking modal collapse, then it seems to be a litmus test for whether or not it's worth using anymore, right? So, like, take this sort of generic one, which would say something like every contingent proposition has a set of prior conditions that necessitates them. Something like, if that's because one strong notion of explanation is A explains B if and only if A entails B, logically, right? And if that's what we mean, then modal collapse is completely straightforwardly right. I mean, you're going to find that there's no necessity there, or you're going to find that there's no contingency there. So I think I'm just sort of on board with that normal kind of collapse argument, the kind of Van Inwagen critique of the modal collapse. And not the critique of the modal collapse, I guess, what I'm saying is critique of the principle of sufficient reason. And I'm also inclined to think that, like, in the, yeah, that there, let's take some, a different notion of explanation, which is causation, right? So A explains B if A causes B. Now I really don't get what the problem is supposed to be if we posit the kind of Cleanthes objection, right, which is, well, I could have a never beginning sequence of causes where one A, whatever, A is caused by B, B is caused by C, C is caused by D, blah blah blah, and there's no first element in that causal chain. Like I know there is no unexplained no unexplained effect there. Every effect you can say what its cause is, right? So game over, right? There is no violation of the principle of sufficient reason. We're all good. That's the Cleanthes objection, really. But the proponent of the PSR will do the kind of Leibniz move, which is to say, well, hold on a sec, okay, fair enough. If I think his example is like, if every year a book was copied and a new version was made from the old one, and we throw away the old one, and then next year we make a copy of the one we just made and we throw that one away, etc. Right? You could say, okay, well, I guess I've explained why for each book. It's got an explanation of why it exists in terms of the copying process and the contents of the previous book. But he'll say, well, how come it's the Bible that we're doing this copying process with, rather than, I don't know, Hard Times by Dickens instead? Like, why this book rather than that one? And you can explain why we're copying the Bible, because today we're copying the Bible because the last book was the Bible and we're just copying it. That's what we're doing. But he thinks it doesn't really give you any kind of explanation of why it's the Bible that you're copying rather than some other book. And one way of thinking about that is that you can say, look, every element in this causal sequence might have an explanation, but the whole causal sequence doesn't have an explanation. Why this rather than completely different instead? And then now to that, the thing I think is, well, the account of modality that I like is a kind of branching account, and according to that, every possible world overlaps with the actual world at some point. So what it means to say that something is possible is just like now say that something is possible is just that there's a range of possible futures ahead of me, and the thing I'm talking about is in one of those possible futures. This is what I mean by metaphysical modality anyway, and other varieties of modality too. Now, if that's right, if that's the account that we're playing with, and that's endorsed by a lot of people who also like the contingency argument and the PSR, like, for instance, Alexander Pruss, right, or Josh Rasmussen, a load of Christian philosophers that I think are good philosophers like this. It's also held by people like Kripke, or obviously not David Lewis, because he kind of attacks the branching view, but it's also held by like Kit Fine and a bunch of leading metaphysicians in the 20th and 21st century like this view too, and it's popular view, right? Noel Belknap, I don't know, a bunch of people. But if that's right, then there's a reply to Leibniz there, because now for the Leibniz reply itself to get going, it has to be the case that it could have been that every event in the past was different to how it actually is, right? Like, how come we're not copying Hard Times by Dickens every day rather than Bible every day, right? Well, what you'd have to do to get to the point where it wasn't the Bible that you were But because every day what happens is they just copy the previous day's book or previous year's book, whatever it is. So if you go back like 2 years, that's obviously not going back far enough to get to the point where they could still be just copying, but for it not to be the Bible. Obviously 2 years, that's not enough time because it's, you go back 2 years, they're still just copying the Bible. But as unfortunately for any n, you go back that many years, they're still just copying the Bible, right? So you can't just go back some finite amount of time to deviate to find some possible future where it's Dickens now instead of the Bible or something, which would explain why it went one way rather than the other. There is no point like that in the past. So for this hypothesis to be true, what would that have to be is that there's a possible world which it never overlaps with the actual world at all. It's just a completely distinct possible world, which is different at every point in the past from the actual world, in which they were doing Dickens every day. And then the thought would be, how come it's not that world rather than this one? The whole point of this account of modality is that it's saying what a metaphysically possible world overlaps with the actual one. So this world that we've just described that doesn't overlap with the actual one, that's not metaphysically possible. But the premise was, well, how come it's the Bible world rather than the Dickens world? Well, the answer is because the Dickens world is literally not a metaphysically possible world. So it's false to say it could have been that one instead. So, initially the Leibniz reply seems quite intuitive, but the thing is, it falls out naturally of this branching view that you've got this reply to Leibniz. And so what that means is that, like, if you want to endorse what Leibniz is saying, you have to somehow explain how what I just said doesn't naturally fall out of the branching view, or abandon the branching view. But so it seems to me that's quite a fun reply, because if people really like the branching view, and it obviously falls out of it, it's kind of trivial, really, how it falls out of it. So you just can't have the branching view and Leibniz's view together at the same time to pick one. And so that's, I guess that's I think that's the most interesting thing I have to say about that type of PSR kind of regressing argument. Maybe that's not on the same lines as what the question was about, but maybe I'm just saying things I think are interesting instead. I don't know.
So somebody asked in your blog, one of the latest arguments is, and this relates to the Bible point, the argument is, if Christianity is true, then a perfect being exists. But if a perfect being exists, then Christianity is false. Therefore, Christianity is false. They're asking, what is the gist of this argument?
Well, yeah. So why I think premise one is true? Well, I think it kind of, lots of versions of the Christianity is multifaceted, right? There's different versions of it, and they say different things. And I'm not even sure that there's very much that every Christian agrees about. Might not be anything, maybe, that God exists. I don't know, but hardly anything else. So possibly some version of Christianity doesn't hold to what I think of premise one, which is basically Christianity involves a perfect being. But surely most of them do, right? Like any philosophical apologetics, mostly anyway, involves this notion of an omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, what have I not said? Omniscient, whatever. The omni-God, right? And that's what I mean by a perfect being. Is a God that's all good and all powerful. So, sure, you may have some versions of Christianity where they say God's like not quite all powerful, or he's pretty good, but he's not perfect. They are surely in the minority. Most people think God is all good and all powerful. And that's really all I mean by premise one. So it seems to me that it's true, at least for a very large majority of Christians. Now, I'm much more familiar with Christianity than I am with Islam. So maybe you can tell me if that's similar in how Islamic theologians and philosophers, they also, presumably most of them, think God is all powerful and all good as well. I mean, it's basically the same concept of God with respect to...
Actually, some of them would negate omnibenevolence.
Okay, there you go then. So that's what I'm saying, is that for those people, then fine, you don't have to agree to premise one. But I guess it's just like, think about it as grouping a bunch of people who do think premise one is true. Surely a lot of theologians do. All right, all religious people think premise 1 is true. But then premise 2, what my point in premise 2 is really just that, like, although Christianity, part of Christianity is that there's this omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, the things that Christianity says about what the God does are incompatible with him being all-powerful and all good. Right? So it's actually, if Christianity is true, then, sorry, if there was an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, it wouldn't be the God of Christianity, is what I think. Because, I mean, take one example. It seems to me that the notion of, what's the clearest one of these to go with? Let's take the Jesus's sacrifice, where he dies for our sins. What's going on there, it seems to me, is that the premise is that we are sinful, right? And that's a deserved kind of moral blameworthiness that we have, because we're not morally perfect, so we're sinful, and therefore deserving of some punishment. But that Jesus intervenes in that and takes the punishment that we should otherwise have. And that's the idea. It's a point of this salvific act or whatever. But that's just like not the application of justice, right? I mean, if somebody does a crime and someone else who didn't do the crime steps in and says to the judge, like, let me take the prison sentence for this guy. Like, if he's unrelated to the crime, all that's happening there is that the person who is morally responsible, should be punished, isn't being. And the person who isn't morally responsible is being punished. And that's obviously a case of injustice. But, you know, an omnibenevolent being plausibly wouldn't manifest gross examples of injustice, right? Why would they? What does it mean that you're like a perfect, say, cosmic judge of the universe, but your central application of that power is something that's blatantly unjust? I mean, just that's not what a perfect being would do. A being would mete out their judgments in proportion to the blameworthiness of the person, right? You wouldn't just switch it to somebody else. Like, if I kill someone, I can be reformed. I could, you know, be forgiven by the parents of the victim or something. I could serve my time in prison. You know, all of that, anything that could happen, you could possibly imagine, doesn't actually mean that I'm not now responsible for the thing that I did. Like, the way morality works is it's basically a permanent thing. When once you, it works both ways, right? If I do a good deed, I'm always going to be the person who did the good deed. If I do a bad deed, I'm always going to be the person who did the bad deed, right? That's how morality works. You can't give it to someone. Can't give my, right? It's absurd. Imagine if I said, I'm going to give like loads of money to charity, but you get to have the moral praiseworthiness for me for the thing that I did. It doesn't make any sense, right? I don't give the moral praiseworthiness of the thing that I did to you. And I can't give you the moral blameworthiness for the thing that I did to you either. It doesn't work like that. In a way, it's a violation of like morality in the first place to think that Jesus can actually inherit your sins. Doesn't make any sense to me. But it's also obviously not a case of justice. It's a stark case of injustice. It's an unjust thing if that were to happen. So Christianity has as part of the narrative that there's a perfect being, but the problem is that the rest of the narrative doesn't fit with the idea of a perfect being. That's what I mean by premise 1 and premise 2. And any other, you can pick one other bits of the Christian story too, but that one's quite stark, I think. Yeah. So I also think the notion of original sin is equally a case of injustice too, right? Because I didn't do anything. I didn't eat of the apple of the forbidden fruit or anything. That wasn't me, right? But I've inherited original sin. Well, what's it got to do with me? Well, why would you blame me for something that I didn't do? That's not just either. So I guess if that's how Islam interprets original sin, I think that the critique also applies to Islam as well. So you might be able to phrase my argument as Islam implies a perfect being. If Islam is true, then it's a perfect being. But if there was a perfect being, Islam wouldn't be true. Like no religion which has a foundational story that embodies an obvious and blatant injustice would be true. Like that's not what, at least a perfect being wouldn't manifest that type of injustice. So any religion that has both of those things in it has a kind of contradiction thereby. So it's a bit like the problem of evil, but you could call it a problem of injustice.
Actually, another question that relates to the problem of evil. Somebody asked, do you think the logical problem of evil would work under the privation theory of evil? And go into detail of that. Also, another related question is, what do you think about the Transworld depravity defense by Plantinga for the problem of evil?
Okay, so they're two very big topics. So, right. So, first one is about this privation theory of evil, which goes back, I think, to St. Augustine. So his idea is that evil is just the absence of good, effectively. So it's not a positive. It's not like when apparently, and I'm no historian, right, but apparently there's this kind of pre-Old Testament phase, pre-Old Testament, intertestament, I think it's pre-Old Testament phase, where one invasion by the Babylonians into the Middle East, I think, I might be summarizing this horribly, but my understanding is that basically there was this big transfer back of lots of captured Middle Eastern people away up into, I guess, close to like Iraq or whatever, but the Babylonian Empire back then. And loads of Jews were taken and then lived for quite a long time in Babylonia and then came back to the Middle East again after that. And what happened was that the fledgling religion of Judaism picked up a load of influences from the Babylonian Zoroastrian religion and came back with new ideas about how the world worked. And partly what's going on is that they now have a view whereby there's a kind of positive and negative supernatural entity fighting each other, because that's basically what Zoroastrianism says. And the two religions kind of mix together a bit, and Judaism now starts having more of this idea of like a satanic or demonic influences as well in the world, and there's this cosmic battle between them or whatever. And that's the view I think that Augustine is pushing back against, because he's trying to say, and I think when he was a younger person, before he became Christian, he was into like Manichaeanism, which is, as far as I understand it, a bit like some similar view on the world, basically. And he's trying to say, no, actually, there is just like the heavenly divine light, and that illuminates some stuff, and the other stuff it's not illuminating isn't like also, it doesn't have like a dark sort of light poured onto it. It's just got no light on it whatsoever. It's just there's just so it's just a divine presence and the absence of that. And I'm like, okay, I get it, right? I actually just think that this interesting, 2,000-year-old move that Augustine makes doesn't really do anything. I think in the problem of evil, like it doesn't matter that evil isn't even if we just grant, okay, evil isn't a positive, ontological kind of force, and maybe there's moral goodness, but there isn't moral badness or something. It doesn't really matter. I mean, because what's relevant in the problem of evil is just whether or not stuff that seems unexpected, given the hypothesis of a perfect being, exists. That's really what the problem of evil is. A perfect being predicts certain things, and we don't see them in the world. We see a lot of stuff that seems different from that. And it doesn't matter if we call it evil, right? It's fine if there's no such thing really as evil. It's still, what we see confounds our expectations given the hypothesis, and that's the problem, right? So presumably, if there's a good God, he doesn't want people to be in, let's say, unnecessary pain, right? maybe he tolerates necessary pain, pain that serves some other purpose or something. So then it can be kind of compensated for by that higher purpose. But purposeless pain and suffering, why would he allow that to happen? Right? In virtue of him, like, if he's good, then what that means to be good is that you don't just let people pointlessly suffer when you could prevent that from happening. And that just seems reasonable. And at no point have I had to say he would eliminate evil. And by evil, I mean the type of evil that's ruled out by the privation theory, right? So I don't really get how the privation theory is even supposed to help with the problem of evil. It seems to me actually irrelevant. It's like, or orthogonal or something. It's just going off in a different direction. So, as far as I can see, unless I'm missing something, there's not really much help there. And the extent that there would be based on a misunderstanding about what the problem of evil was. That, if there is no such thing as evil, then there's no problem of evil or something. It sounds like a kind of Frank Turek hot take or whatever that's not very good, say the least. Okay, so now we want to talk about transworld depravity. Plantinga's response is completely different to the privation theory, right? Plantinga thinks that it's basically a free will defense, so that, why do bad things happen? Let me put my thoughts in order. Right, yeah. So if we're talking about like human evils, I suppose, like our misdeeds to our fellow man or whatever, a reply to that is to say that, well, the reason that can take place is because God endowed man with the freedom to pick the things that they think is the right thing to do. So, yeah, of course, sometimes they'll pick the wrong thing and, hurt each other. But the gift of freedom is worth it, right? It's like, if we didn't have that freedom, then we wouldn't be able to do whatever, blah, blah, blah. So standard free will defense, like that's the general move that he's trying to make. And then I haven't thought about this for ages, so I might be butchering this, but then his idea is about Molinism, right? Which is where God knows not just what you're going to do in the future, what you will actually do, as opposed to what you'll possibly or necessarily do. He knows what you're actually going to do. But the distinctive thing about Molinism, because so far that's just called Ockhamism after William of Ockham, but the Molinist move is to add to that Ockhamist view, the view that also God knows what you would have done had you been in a different situation. So let's say I live in a monastery, and as such, I'm completely, I'm never tempted by any sins because I'm like locked away in this monastery. It's all fine. But so in that sense, God knows that I won't sin because I won't have the option to never come up. So I'm good. But not just that, God knows that, had things gone differently, right, then he knows that how things would, whether I would have sinned, So let's say I never actually get tempted to, but there's some possible world where I just leave the monastery and I go down to the brothel or something, and then there's some temptation, and he knows whether I'm going to give in to that temptation or not. Like, even though I'm not in that situation, he knows that I would give in, say, or I would abstain. So I think, I think that's very, very dubious idea, the Molinist idea. But Plantinga loves it. He's basically a Molinist, and I think the idea is that he's going to say, listen, maybe I'm getting this wrong. Actually, now I'm saying it out loud. What I've said about Molinism is right, but his view is a transworld depravity view that everybody sins in some world or another. Where there's no world where somebody just contingently picks the abstinence life in every possible world. Right? Then in some possible world, when some counterfactual situation, there's an actual future where you sin. I think that's his view. But anyway, I think whatever, maybe it's a stronger scope than that. But whatever. I think the Plantinga's view is based on Molinism, and I think Molinism doesn't make sense on its own terms. So thereby, it can't be a successful defense to the problem of evil, because it presupposes Molinism, which is incoherent. This transworld depravity idea, I mean, it's not even a question of, do I think transworld depravity as a thesis is true? I don't even think Plantinga thinks that it's true. He thinks that it just needs to be possibly true for it to be a defense, because it's all he needs to do is show some. Because, like, if you're taking yourself to respond to Mackey's like strong problem of evil, all you need to do is say that God's omnipotent benevolence, etc., doesn't entail that there would be no evil. So all there has to be is some propositions like God is omnibenevolent, all powerful, etc., and there's some evil and something. As long as that combination is possible, then that's enough to refute the argument. All he needs to do is posit something that's logically consistent with those propositions that blocks the conclusion, and that's it. He doesn't actually have to believe that it's true. So doesn't, although it's kind of like this Calvinist idea of, what is it, total depravity or whatever, but he's positing, just he's riffing on that idea and saying, well, maybe there's transworld depravity. And as I remember, it's the idea that there's no one who doesn't sin in some possible world. Everybody is sinful in some possible world, right? I think that's the view. But anyway, as I said, he cashes it out in terms of this Molinist idea, and it requires the thought that in a counterfactual situation, one of potentially many contingent things is labeled as the actual one. And I reject that on basically logical grounds. I don't think that makes much sense at all. Quite difficult to explain the detail of that without drawing pictures on a chalkboard or whatever. But if you can picture, like, if the world is branching whenever there's contingency, right? If you've got this temporal modal view of what modality is like, right? So it's possibilities are in the future and the past is linear. You can kind of build, like, you picture a big tree that's got branches branching away from each other, right? The optimist, this is a view that I hold, would say, okay, sure, well, there's lots of possible branches, but like one of the branches from top to bottom is like, let's draw it in red as opposed to all the others that are drawn in black, right? That thin red line is the actual world. And that's like, as time passes, the branches that you don't go up basically stop being possible, right? But there's just one branch that you actually go up, even though there are multiple possible branches. Like if I am going to flip a coin, right before I flip the coin, could land heads, could land tails. There's two branches ahead of me. Then I flip the coin and it lands heads. I want to say, a minute ago, before I flipped the coin, I didn't know that the heads branch was red, that it was the actual one, but it was. Because like before I flip the coin, if I say the coin will land heads, like I'm predicting that it will land heads, then lo and behold, my prediction was true, right? When I look back and I say, oh, the prediction was true. Like, it was true at the time that I said it. I didn't know it was true. Couldn't have known it was true, but it was. Just like if I say the coin will land tails and heads, my prediction was false, right? It was wrong. So the easiest way to account for everything that's going on there is that you think that there's an actual future that you didn't know about, but was sort of metaphysically real, even if it was epistemically inaccessible to you. Now, if you start to think to yourself, well, okay, maybe it's just counterfactual as well. Like, so I got a coin in my pocket. I haven't, at noon or something, stroke of noon, I don't take it out of my pocket. I just leave it there, right? But then 1 minute past noon, I say to myself, had I flipped the coin at noon then, instead of leaving it in my pocket, it would have landed heads, let's say. So I make a kind of counterfactual prediction about which way it would have landed. Well, now, I think, just without going into the kind of like pictures and proofs and stuff, I just think, like, my view is, sure, this, obviously I couldn't possibly know. It's still epistemically inaccessible to me which way coin would have landed had I flipped it. But I just think there's something kind of groundless about saying, well, it would have landed one way and not the other, right? It's like, if I'd had a sister, would she have been called Susan? I mean, either she would or she wouldn't. Obviously, either she would or she wouldn't. Right? It's true that if I'd had a sister, she would have been called Susan, or if I'd had a sister, she wouldn't have been called Susan. No, sorry. It's true that if I'd had a sister, then either she'd have been called Susan or not. Right? That's true. But it's not that one of those is true rather than the other. right? It's a disjunction where neither of the things on their own are actually true. It's just, it covers all logical possibilities, so the disjunction is true. But I don't think either of the actual disjuncts is true. And then nothing could make it true anyway. So it's unlike the passage of time with the actual world. What happens when I flip the coin and it lands heads is it's time passed. That happened. That's what makes it one way or the other. It's grounded in that actuality of the actual world. Whereas these possible worlds, even if you think they're not simply expressions and that there's some ontology behind them, they obviously don't come to pass. So nothing ever actually breaks the symmetry between them. And for that reason, I just think it's silly to think that God could know what you would do in a situation that you didn't actually go through. Right? I just think that's fanciful. I also think logically the models don't make any sense. But so Plantinga's whole project doesn't work because it presupposes Molinism. The whole project is incoherent. Anyway, I think, that's what I think.
So one other question would be, what do you think about the response to the evolutionary argument against naturalism? Oh, no, what do you think of that? Or do you have a response?
Well, every time I hear anyone bring this up, so it's not one of the arguments I've really spent any time reading the literature on or doing any work on, right? So it's not particularly well-informed position that I'm going to take on this, right? But having said that, every time anyone brings it up, I do get the feeling. So what I mean by that caveat at the beginning is I can't off the top of my head recall the premises exactly, and maybe what I'm saying is based on just hearing the summaries, and I should really go and look at how Plantinga puts it exactly. But it seems to me that there's this idea that if you are a naturalist, and by naturalist here we just mean someone who doesn't think there are supernatural causes, basically. If you're a naturalist like that, then if you've got a capacity, say for logical reasoning or something, then it's not because God gave it to you, because there's no supernatural causation. So it must have been that it arose naturally. That's supposed to be the target of this type of argument. And the idea is that Plantinga thinks if you think that evolution gave rise to your rational faculties, then you're in trouble, basically, because evolution isn't aimed at providing you with things. It's not like tracking truth or something, right? And your mental faculties may have been like forged in the smithy of evolution, but what you get out of that type of process is just faculties that are good for survival, says Plantinga. And that means they can deviate from tracking truth. And he has these examples of like, I used to remember this a lot better. But he's like confected examples about like you can respond to something in such a way that it saves your life whilst being a false belief. So it might be evolutionarily beneficial for you to, say, run away from something like a lion or whatever, but under the basis of a false belief. Just so long as it saves your life, then it will be evolutionary beneficial, and that will get passed down. And so what evolution is doing is not some kind of process that reliably, gives you true beliefs. It's a process that reliably gives you beliefs good enough that your ancestors would survive if they had them, something, right? And that means it's not truth tracking, and therefore it's supposed to undermine the idea that you can use that. Like, if you think evolution is what gave you your rational faculties, then you should doubt your rational faculties, because you should think evolution is an unreliable producer of mental states or something, including your belief that you're rational, basically, in the first place. So Plantinga loves the idea of this this kind of self-referential move or whatever, where it's like the belief, if you think you're rational and that naturalism produced that, then evolution shows you that even the belief in rationality is not justified, whatever. So there's loads of examples of that in different works. Like his early epistemological stuff, it's constantly like finding this it's a typical sort of example about like about like, yeah, this is a good example for it. Like sometimes people critique like naive atheists for saying things like, I only believe in what science can prove to me or whatever. And then someone will get the ponage line about like, oh, did science show you that you can only believe what science can show you? Right? No, it didn't, because it's not really an empirical thing. So it's refuting or whatever, because you're saying I only believe according to this standard, but then the standard doesn't apply to that statement itself. Like that's the sort of move that Plantinga likes to do, and that's what's going on in this argument here. He's trying to say, that it's rationality itself is a thing that you can't believe in because of this evolutionary process. Okay, I think that's broadly speaking how Plantinga puts it. Maybe I'm getting some aspects of it wrong. Obviously, I think it's Bayesian, so there's some numbers moving around on the back of this that I don't think matter here. I guess my sort of stock thought about it though is that I don't think that. So I think that rationality, which is a very vague concept, right, isn't just something that's all or nothing. You can be more or less rational in different ways, and over time, and blah 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 blah. It's not just like I'm rational, I'm not rational. That's it. And I just think that for me, I don't expect that an evolutionary lineage provides me with some just black and white notion of I'm just rational. I'm just completely rational. Like I think I'm not completely rational. That's a normal thing to think. Some of my reasoning processes are almost certainly wrong. Some of the things I believe are almost certainly false, right? I'm not perfectly rational. So I just don't think I'm endowed with like that type of perfect rationality by evolution. Now, what I do think is plausible, though, is that there's a survival benefit to rationality to some extent, like the differing degree, like basically the more rational you are, the more likely you are to be able to creatively come up with a solution to a problem that you've got. Basically, the more intelligent that you are, let's say. And that's obviously it could be very beneficial in an evolutionary sense. And I think there's a trade-off between how big your brain can be and how that affects birthing and blah, blah, blah. But there must be some kind of ratio that nature arrives. But there's some kind of process whereby the bare faculty to use reason might originally have just been running away from this and picking up that, making fire, whatever, making spears and stuff. I don't know what we were using rationality for. It's not like one day it started and the day before that we had nothing. It's a sliding scale, but I'm just thinking after a certain amount of time, that tool can be used for something that evolution didn't have any hand in. Like after millions or hundreds of thousands of years of having some degree of rationality, we slowly, painstakingly started to drag ourselves out of just being like bare recipients of nature's environment to crafting it instead ourselves. And we're sort of applying back the rational faculty and using it. And that, I think, starts to become something like a cumulative process, because once you invent something, you pass that down to the next person. They don't have to invent it again. They can modify that. It's easier for them to spend their full 100% of their brain power, not having to do all the work that you did, but just extending that further. And that seems to me, take the evolution of mathematics over thousands of years, whatever. That's basically what happened. We didn't just get mathematics all in one go. Evolution didn't just give us mathematics, but possibly it gave us the kind of, from an evolutionary survival standpoint, that, and maybe it was lucky, I don't know, I don't really know how it came about in the first place at all, but that faculty, their like capacity to think, even in a most mediocre sense, rationally, and over hundreds or thousands of years of cumulative transmission through generations, might mean that now we find ourselves wake up in the world with a kind of linguistic historical inheritance from the people who've come before us and used their proto or actual rationality to do things like work out very basic geometrical relations and logical blah blah blahs. And now what we're doing is building upon the stuff that they've given us. And I don't see anything implausible about that at all. Like my sure, my intuitions that come directly from evolution may often be unreliable and point me in the wrong direction. But the point is that you study and use discipline and peer correcting and whatever to try and pull yourself out of your own evolutionary inheritance and into the kind of collective human intellectual inheritance that surrounds you. It's difficult, and nobody's perfect at it, and I'm certainly not. But I just think that the whole picture that Planting is working with is unnecessarily uncharitable to, and maybe there are evolutionary psychologists or whatever who will try and draw a straight line between we believe this thing, therefore evolution made us believe that in our past or something. I use these sort of tacky explanations for like the gender pay gap or something. Is because when we were cavemen, the men would be out hunting all day and the women would stay in. That type of like silly drawing an evolutionary explanation out of some contemporary thing is just, that just sounds dumb, because it's like, not everything that happens now has to be a product of evolution, right? Loads of stuff happened on the history of this species, and you can't just say that every aspect of it is directly caused by evolution. That's like not the thesis that every naturalist is committed to. So yeah, I just think that it's almost like a ride-along trait or something, rationality, which might be useful for something, but then just sort of sticks around. And then now we find that actually it's really super useful if we apply it to other things. And sometimes if you're lucky and really careful, you can use your rationality the right way. I don't know. So I just think, yeah, I'm not worried at all about Planting this argument. It just sounds like a big effort at trying to draw up a controversy about something by basically strawmanning what the naturalist view could be. Yeah, I don't know. And that all might be bollocks, what I just said, but it just seems to me that that's right.
So somebody wants to ask, what is your... So quick, do you accept Aristotle's analysis of change to potency?
I don't know.
So they're basically asking, what is your approach to it? Do you accept it, do you reject it, and why to both? If yes, why? If no, why?
Okay, I don't know. So again, it's another one of those things where like I haven't like committed a large part of research to the question in particular, and maybe I would come to a decision if I did. But I think the way I look at it, there's broadly speaking two frameworks that you could apply to analyze change and stuff. And they both have stuff going for them. And I'm not sure I have a big view about better. So let's say you've got the Aristotelian view on the one hand, where change is the actualization of some potency or whatever. But then you've got an alternative view, which might be Humean or Russellian or something, which just simply says, like, it's just about a proposition having a different truth value at a different time, and that's all there is to it. Now, if you take that latter view, it's kind of Russellian view, it seems to me what's got going for it is it's super compatible with the findings of science, basically. So, like, you can talk about like the transference of like force between objects as they interact with each other and write all the equations down, and that makes perfect sense. And that can be given, that's very easy to interpret that in a Russellian fashion. So like, the ball has this momentum at this time, and then it's got a different momentum at a different time. That's change. That's what we mean. Basically it's about things bumping into each other and transferring energy or whatever. So great with compatibility, a big tick in the compatibility with science box. So it basically is what science tells us, I think. But downside is it doesn't really feel like that on the inside, and it also seems quite sparse as an explanation. So it's kind of like nominalistic almost, and yeah, okay. So it's a sort of metaphysically thin view, and then the Aristotelian one is kind of the other way around, right? It's like once you adopt the terminology and talk like that, then you've got like thick modal notions, and often that's quite satisfying as a theoretical notion to play with, and I am sympathetic to, yeah, for sure. But at the same time, it's hard to see what's going on. Like, there's no such thing as a potency in physics, for instance, or actualization isn't a exchange of force or something. Like, what's going on? How do you reconcile those two things together? I think that's a very difficult question. So yeah, I guess that's my basic thumbnail sketch of that. I don't like pick one of them. I guess the branching view I was talking about before probably is an example of thick modal notions. So it's broadly Aristotelian. There's probably some other views I like Aristotelian in some respects as well. But that doesn't mean that like I'm committed to them. I mean, even in that, I'm not committed to the branching view really. The question is like, what can you do with a position, and how does it interact with other things? For that, it's better to sort of advocate like a lawyer would do for a defendant for the purpose of like winning the case, rather than like believing necessarily that the defendant is innocent. Right? You can, in philosophy, you can sort of say, well, look, hold on, this view. What about if this view was true? Then how does this argument now fare, or something like that's more like what's going on in that branching paper with Joe, rather than being like, this is my hand on heart, the thing I believe, or whatever. And if you push me, I guess I think maybe there's a distinction in outlook between religious and non-religious people. I mean, I don't know if this is, I don't mean to insult anybody, of course, but like, if you're religious, to some extent, I guess, it's different types of religion, obviously, but some types of religion anyway, it's very prescriptive and people like it like that. So that it's sometimes if you're a Catholic, you can just be like, what do we think about, topic X? And you can go and like find what the, Vatican II says about blah, blah, blah. And every question there's some view about like, that's what we think in the church or whatever. And, I guess sometimes I find with talking with religious people who have that outlook, they're like, oh, what do you have what Platonism and stuff like this? And it's like, well, not in the way you do, like not as in I've got a big list of things and that's what I'm committed to. It's not quite like that, right? When you don't have a doctrine or kind of belong to an institution that's defined by its beliefs, you don't really ever have to commit to anything like in the same way. Obviously, I think some things are true and I think some things are false, but I don't have to have that view about everything. And philosophy often is one of those things where it's quite a grey area topic, and approaching it with the kind of black and white, with that type of religious view, anyway, not necessarily every religious view is like that, but if, we all know people like that, and sometimes they're just approaching the subject wrong. It's like they're blundering their way through a china shop or something. And I don't know if the questioner has that in mind, but it seems to me that I often get questions like that, where do you think this? I don't know what I think about that. I often kind of like ideas or don't like them, rather than believing them as opposed to not believing them. I quite like the Aristotelian view, but doesn't mean I think it's got no problems, or that I would take it to be something like a proposition I solemnly hold to believe in or something. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's a bit ranty as an answer, but hopefully that'll do.
So somebody asked, is existence a predicate?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those ones like before where there's a range of different accounts, and I'm not clear that there's a really good reason to even to have to pick one rather than the other. So there's like logical systems where it is, and there are logical systems where it isn't. I don't have any good, unlike where before, I really like these branching models that are like alchemist, and I really hate the ones that are like Molinist, and I could give you lots of good reasons, or I think good reasons why I don't like the Molinist ones. In this distinction, I have far less expertise, so I couldn't really tell you. Certainly, standard classical logic doesn't treat existence as a predicate, but it's not very difficult to modify classical logic such that it does. And I actually don't know that there's any particular controversy about doing that. I think Troy's on the line, and he, I'm sure, will be able to explain the merits of, a free logic, basically, better than I can. And he's welcome to do that if he wants to, or not. It's up to him.
The final question would be, what are your views on free will?
Okay, so I think I'm broadly speaking a compatibilist. I did I did a debate with this guy called Tim Stratton, who's another Christian apologist guy, and his whole thing is he calls it the free thinking argument. So he thinks basically that it's like the argument from reason, or really C.S. Lewis's argument from reason. So it's like, unless you were free, then you wouldn't be rational. And then it has this kind of like Plantingian self-referential thing to it as well, because it's like the problem here is supposed to be if your thoughts are produced by chemical processes that are determined in advance, then that's supposed to undermine the idea that they're rational thereby, right? They're sort of, I guess, there's this implied dichotomy between being mechanical, causally determined, and being rational, which somehow has to be non-mechanical or non-causal or something. And that all just seems, again, like bollocks to me. I think Van Inwagen has this crushing reply to Lewis, and certainly Tim Stratton doesn't understand that. And he wrote a paper with J.P. Moreland, although it's not quite clear to me how much Moreland wrote. It reads very much like Tim Stratton the whole way through when I read it. But if that's right, then Moreland also thinks that you need freedom for rationality. And I actually think John Searle thinks that as well, weirdly. So, yeah, there's some people who think that, but I just think, it seems preposterous to think that you couldn't have, say, some mechanism, like an Android or something, which has little cameras for eyes and little microphones or whatever for ears, and can basically take in sensory input like we can to some extent. And it just seems absurd to think that there couldn't be a mechanism like that, which, I don't know whatever percentage of the time my beliefs are true rather than false, but let's say it was 90%. I don't know. Maybe that's ridiculous. Maybe it's like 5%. I don't know. But whatever the percentage is, it just seems absurd to imagine that there couldn't be a mechanism that achieves that number. I just don't understand what the argument's supposed to be. It seems plainly physically possible, if only by accident. Then it just seems that there's no contradiction involved, and that it doesn't violate any law of physics. Certainly doesn't imply it's not just self-contradictory. So what's the problem supposed to be? I don't get that. It feels to me like if you think a mechanism like that is possible, then you're a determinist. Then you're a compatibilist. But at the very least, I suppose you could be a determinist. But you can't think rationality requires freedom anyway. That seems to me like the clearest the argument I can see to the end of. So yeah, I don't think there are good arguments for kind of like a libertarian free will. There's a whole lot of arguments about the incoherence of it as well. And then it looks a bit like a contingency sort of argument again. Like if I've got libertarian freedom, then I can choose between P and Q, say. And it can't be that there's some like causally exhaustive set of preconditions, right, which determine which one I do, because then I wouldn't be free. So it has to be that the causal antecedents underdetermine what I do there. But then, to the extent that you think that causes provide explanations for things, that's just you saying that there isn't really an explanation for why you pick A rather than B. Right? What's the explanation supposed to be? It's not, you can't reach for antecedent conditions, because the whole point of libertarian freedom is that they I can pick B or A. It's up to me. It doesn't matter what's happened before then. It's like a completely free choice down to me. Yeah, and so, well, if you think that there is a principle of, like, in a relatively strong principle of sufficient reason, then that's just in violation of that libertarian freedom. So yeah, those two things are difficult to reconcile. Maybe they're impossible to reconcile. But yeah, I guess, short answer, I think I'm just a compatibilist, and yeah, and more strongly think that libertarian freedom is dodgy than have a positive view. But if I had a positive view, it would be compatibilism.
Yes. So I think that is it. No.
Okay.
Dr. Alex, I actually want to thank you so much. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you here.
No problem. Thank you.